Folding the edge of a paper using a template is a little like cheating because you will not get a realistic end result. However, with PaintShop and a few simple steps, you can create a folded edge that will look more realistic. I'll start here with a full-size paper, and I'm going to make more than one fold. I could do a single fold, but this would be too easy. So let's start with using the freehand selection tool set to point, and I'll just extend here my image, and I will make a few sections. I'll go down, and from the first click I'll go up, and I can go down, I can go down. It's recommended that the last one will be going down, and I'll explain why later. And you select everything like this, and you right click on your image, promote the selection to a layer. At the bottom, you make sure that it's not a background layer. It has to be a raster. If it's not, then you will have to right click and promote the background layer. In this case, it's already a raster. So by going down to the bottom layer, you hit the delete key. So you'll have one piece that will be the top and one piece that's going to be your main paper, and you deselect with Control D. Now let's cut those pieces on top in sections. I'll hide the bottom layer so we will see better, and I'll zoom in. Again, using that point-to-point selection tool, I will start close to that corner here or that angle and click in the ruler. I find that clicking in the ruler will create that selection really close to the edge and not risking having a few leftover pixels. So with this area selected, you right click, promote to selection to a layer, and back down you hit the delete key. So this means that this piece will be on its own layer, and then you'll have the bottom layer that you will keep working on. So let's hide this one. Now on that larger piece, I'll go again with that next corner. You can go at an angle, you can go straight, it's really up to you. And you select. Again, right click, promote selection to a layer, down, delete. So I can hide it. Last, I go to the corner, select that area, right click, promote selection to a layer, down, delete. I can hide it. Now here, just to make sure I don't have anything left over, I will still do the selection and select in here, and I will invert the selection. I can go under selection, invert, or I can use Control Shift I, and I will delete anything that might be left over. So if there's any stray pixel on the other side of the paper, it won't be connected anymore. So, and I delete and I deselect. So I'll start with that one piece on the left, and I will unhide my base paper. To fold this piece of paper, I could be tempted to simply rotate it, but this will not make those pieces matching, and you have that design if it will not look good. So the first step will be having the right layer active will be better, and you go under image and you flip vertical. So you can see here, this is my piece of paper, but I need to have this angle match the paper one. So I'll use the pick tool, or if you have an older version of PaintShop, you can use the raster deform tool. It does the same thing. So you rotate it to what you think will match. Sometimes it might be a little hard to see if it matches, so you can reduce the opacity of the base layer and go back to that top one, and then you can see much easier. Okay, so it's hard to turn. One thing you can see is here on top you'll have the angle. So if I rotate by 4.8 degrees, it seems to be a little bit too much, so maybe I'll just change the settings on this to 0.7. No, maybe not, so I can go down to 6. So you can tweak like this much more precisely than using the handle. Okay, you try to be as precise as you can, but don't lose too much sleep over it. So this is good enough. Now I'll just repeat the same thing with the other piece. So I'll go under Image, Flip Vertical, try to turn a bit, and I'll see that here it's 19 degrees. I'd like to have more, so maybe I'll go with 21. Maybe 22. Oh, that's much better. And I will align my pieces. If you were to reduce the opacity of that top one, you can see how the design of the top piece really matches the design from the bottom piece, which is what you want. Okay, let's go on the third one. Image, flip, and let's rotate. So this was rotated a bit too much, so I'll go with maybe 328. Oops, that's the other way around. 32. Maybe a bit more. 33. Close. So you try to just match the corners. Of course, the middle will follow. And let's go with the last one. Image, flip, and rotate. Here I was saying how if you had your fold going upward, what will happen is that a piece of paper will extend past the edge of your image. Well, if you're going downward, you have the piece of paper that will go inward. So it's going to be easier if you want to manipulate a whole page and stay inside the border of your image. Sorry, okay, that's a little bit too much. Maybe if I go down to 56, maybe I'll go maybe to 55. Yeah. Okay, so I have my 4 pieces that are kind of ready for the next step. The next step is going to add some volume, because here my base image has a lower opacity, so it's easy to see the difference. But if they are all at 100%, it's not as obvious. In this case, I had kind of a difference in the border, so it does show a bit more, but we can do even better. So using your selection tool set to point again, you select one edge of one piece, and I'm going to be working on the top one. You go to selection, modify, feather, and you can feather a fair bit. I have it set at 50, and you might change that. The wider the feathering, the more your paper will look like it's rolled, and the smaller the number, it's going to be more like it's folded as opposed to rolled. And I go under adjust, brightness, contrast, and since this area here is supposed to be facing more the light source that is traditionally top left, you'll increase the brightness like this. So I'm about, I don't know, 75 or so. It might depend on the color or pattern for your paper. And you deselect. Let's do the same thing on the second piece. Selection, modify, feather, and activating the right layer. Since this one is not facing the light source as much, the setting will be slightly less. So instead of 76, I can go down to maybe 50. And I go back, so deselect, go to the next one, selection, modify, feather. Again, this on the right layer is going to be more than the previous one because it's angled more. Oops. Brightness contrast. And going back more to the 70, 80 or so. And this one here is probably going to be, I would call it almost neutral, but maybe I'll make it just a tiny bit light. So I go under selection, modify, feather, same settings for the feathering, adjust, brightness contrast, and not much at all, like maybe 30 at the most. Like I said, that in this example I had an edge that was already darker, so I might be able to leave it as is. If you have a paper that was more or less even, or maybe a plain paper, you might want to add something else. So let's go back to that first piece and I'll select the end, the part that was not lightened, and again I'll add some feathering. And this time I will go with darkening that piece of paper. And not too much, but again, it's up to you. And I'll go in the second piece. Modify, feather, always the same settings. Adjust, brightness, contrast, and I can go down. Maybe not as much, since it's a little closer to that light source. And this one will probably be more of a darkening. Selection, modify, feather, adjust, brightness, contrast. And the last one. Selection, modify, feather. And I won't go too much on this one because it's kind of close to that angle. Okay, so this is already looking interesting. Of course, I have only 4 pieces, but if you wanted to make a project and you might need to have 12 folds, it's okay. It's just the same settings and the same steps you have to take. But now you have to have some shadow. So let's go back to that first piece. You adjust, you go under Effect, 3D Effect, Drop Shadow. And you can look at the shadow here. The offset really won't matter much because you'll tweak that. I want to have a good blur, although again I can adjust it later. And remember that the more blur you have, the more it would look like the end here is flipped up as opposed to being completely flat. But since I had this lightning here to kind of show that it's not completely flat, so I have to have a good blur. And I want to make sure that the shadow is on a new layer because I'll need to tweak it. So you click OK, and while you have your shadow layer active, you reactivate the pick tool, and this is where you can stretch it downward a bit. Notice here it's moving off, so I'll just realign it. I can go toward this direction if I want, and that could work. Of course, here I have a shadow that really I don't want, so I'll just use my point-to-point selection tool and I'll cut off that part of the shadow. So if my shadow is too dark, too opaque, I can just change the opacity a bit if I want. And for the second one, I'll use the same settings for my drop shadow. And again, with the pick tool, I'll stretch it down a bit and maybe toward the right. And using my point-to-point selection tool, I'll cut off from the corner. Something like this. Of course, if you go very close, you will see now that the edge is not blurred. So what I could do, I could just add some blur, Gaussian blur, not much. Something like this. And again, I might want to reduce the opacity if I find it's too much. Again, it's all a matter of choice. Let's repeat on the third piece. Effect, 3D effect, drop shadow. And with the pick tool, I just hit the K key on my keyboard. I just pull it down and adjust for that corner here. And I have a little bit too much on top. Since this is an area I don't need, I can very easily cut it off and I won't even have to worry about the blur. And finally, the last piece, you add your shadow. And you pull it down again. You could use your pick tool and using the shift key, you hit on the shift key and you see that middle node will change and you can move that bottom piece like this. You can see. But now it's a little too much on the side here, so I'll just narrow it a bit. Go back. Because I have here that corner that's really not what I want. But that shadow is extending now past my paper, so I'll have to work on it. Inward a bit. Something like this. And again, if it's extending, I use my point-to-point selection tool and I'll remove that area. And I can adjust the opacity if I want, up to you. Okay, and here you have a folded edge that really will be more realistic because everything in the pattern will match. If you have a busy pattern, it might not be as obvious. If you happen to have stripes or something extremely regular, it will really look obvious that you did the right thing in folding the edge. So, although it's not a quick tip, it's that easy. Have fun!